Well, good morning, everyone. Whether you're here in person or joining us online, my name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here at St. Bart's, and it is my joy and delight to welcome you here for the forum where each week we have important conversations about the things that matter. And we're very honored to have with us today our Borough President, Mark Levine, who is here to talk about this wonderful borough that we call home. Mark, it's great to have you here. Thank you for taking the time to be here. Mark has been our Borough President since January 1st, 2022, and he has a long history in city politics before that. He served on the City Council for 8 years prior to assuming this role.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks for taking the time on this summer Sunday to be with us, Mark.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for having me here. It's great to be at St. Bart's. I have such high esteem for this congregation and what you have stood for over the decades. You know, this is a time where LGBTQ rights are under attack nationally. Trans kids are under attack. Even same-sex marriage is under attack with the Supreme Court that we have. It's been so destructive. St. Bart's has been there embracing everybody, opening to all, steadfastly over the decades, and it means more than ever. I'm really grateful to you, and grateful to be here this morning to talk about the future of this borough of Manhattan as we come out of a very difficult 2.5 years, as we continue to manage ongoing public health challenges, as we work to bring our economy back from such an intense shock during the pandemic, and as we really even think about the future of Manhattan as an economic hub because of all the changes post-COVID. As we confront the deep inequality that was revealed and exacerbated during the COVID years, which impacts really every sector of life here. And as we talk about the generational challenge of climate change and what it means for Manhattan, what our role is in fighting back, and the work we have to do to adapt to the climate change that's already here on this island. My good friend Jay Matung, who's on staff here, who invited me, suggested that I start by talking a little bit about how I got here, how I wound up as your borough president. I didn't start out in politics. I actually studied physics in college and became a teacher, a science teacher in the South Bronx. I taught bilingual math and science at Junior High School 149 in District 7. And that really was the job that launched me into a career of community work. I went on to start a nonprofit to address one of the biggest challenges that my students and their families faced, which was lack of access to financial services. So I started a community development credit union in Washington Heights. And it's sort of like a cooperatively owned bank. It's made $25 million in microloans, helping families uptown do everything from buy their first home computer, pay for education, start their own small business. The repayment rate on those loans is 98%, which is a great testament to giving people an opportunity. That's the base that allowed me to run for office, 5,000 credit union members, and ultimately, really proud to have been elected to the City Council, serving a district in northern Manhattan. It's from 96th Street on the west side up through West Harlem and Washington Heights. Was able to serve for 8 years, as Peter mentioned, in the City Council. I chaired the Parks Committee my first term. I'm incredibly passionate about green space. I see it as an equity issue. I chaired the Health Committee my second term. In that capacity, I really put my heart and soul into fighting the pandemic, fighting for a response based on science and equity and compassion, and I'm still very, very involved in public health issues. And then last year, was elected by many of you to be your Manhattan Borough President. I've been in the office, as Peter mentioned, since January. It's probably worth spending a couple seconds explaining what this job is, because Borough President is unique to New York City, and I think some people, even in New York City government, aren't entirely sure what it is. We have powers in 4 major areas. We have a big control over land use matters, which is zoning and preservation, a topic I gather is quite relevant to St. Bart's. but basically what you can build where and how big and of what type, that runs through the borough president's office. So I'm thinking a lot about the built environment of the city, of course. We have a budget authority, so capital money to invest in schools and libraries and cultural institutions and parks, et cetera. We have over 1,000 appointments to boards and bodies, most prominently community boards, which are our hyper-local government in Manhattan and New York City, and many, many other boards, from the city's pension funds to hospital advisory boards, parks conservancies, business improvement districts, and more. And then finally, we have the ability to introduce legislation in the city council. Not a vote there, but introduce legislation. What it all adds up to really is, I think, a very important platform for putting forth an agenda for the borough, fighting for the unique interests of Manhattanites, and then organizing to implement it. And I'll just mention a few of the things that I've been working on in my first 7 months. I guess I'll start because it's so much in the news this weekend with my work on public health. At a time when I think we're all now absorbing the fact that we're in an era of contagious disease, that COVID was not the last pandemic and not the last crisis of an infectious disease that emerges in ways we don't expect. We're now making enormous progress in our battle against COVID, which I can talk about if we have time, but we're simultaneously dealing with the emergence of monkeypox, which is having such a very, very intense impact right now on one specific segment, predominantly in Manhattan and New York City, which is gay, bisexual, and men who have sex with men. New York City is the epicenter of the monkeypox outbreak nationally. Manhattan is the epicenter in New York City, and we're seeing a steady rise in cases here. Last night, the mayor declared a state of emergency because of the public health crisis on monkeypox. It pains me that we are repeating so many of the same mistakes that we made in the early days of battling COVID, where we have shortage of testing capacity, shortage of treatments, and a shortage of vaccination. It's really maddening that we still suffer from public health systems which are hollowed out. We've been underinvesting in them, and we're paying the price now in the monkeypox outbreak, which I'm happy to talk more about. But everyone should care about this, not just if you're a member of the LGBTQ community, but because anyone can get monkeypox, anyone can spread it, and ultimately we all have a stake in managing this. Next, I'll mention an issue which really was my proudest accomplishment in the City Council. I was really proud to pass legislation making New York City the first place in America to establish right to counsel for tenants facing eviction in housing court. It really started the national movement, actually. Many other cities and states have followed our lead. This is still a moment of enormous challenge in housing and affordable housing and tenants' rights in New York City. We had a period during the pandemic where some of the normal rules didn't apply, but now coming out of it, we're seeing rents rising at an alarming rate. The median rent in Manhattan is $4,100 a month right now for market rate rentals. The median purchase price is $1.3 million in Manhattan, meaning that not only low-income New Yorkers, but really even middle-class New Yorkers are unable to afford housing in the city. There's also enormous pressure on low-income tenants who are in housing now but face the threat of eviction. We had a moratorium during the COVID pandemic for the better part of 2 years. That ended in January. And we have seen a steady rise in the number of eviction cases since. So much so that the number of cases is overwhelming the legal service providers. So I mentioned that we now have right to counsel in New York City, but there are simply more eviction cases than there are lawyers to represent tenants. So we are not fulfilling certainly the spirit, if not the letter, of the right to counsel law. And as a result, the number of evictions is steadily rising month to month. in Manhattan and New York City. That is directly connected to the homeless crisis. There are misconceptions about what leads to homelessness in New York City, but the largest number of people who are in homeless shelters is families, not actually single adults. About 2/3 of the people in homeless shelters are families, typically single moms and kids. And the number one reason that families cite for entering the shelter system is not mental health issues or substance abuse issues, it is eviction. And so there's a direct correlation between the work we do to keep people in their homes and the number of people who are in our shelter system. And hopefully we can talk more about that. The last issue I'll mention before we can have some dialogue with all of you is the challenge of climate change and resiliency for Manhattan. All of us are feeling it again this summer as we deal with extreme heat. We've dealt with it in recent years from everything from heat waves to unprecedented rain events and flooding and more. Climate change is here, and we know that. And Manhattan has a role, New York City has a role in fighting back. We should lead the world in the race to carbon neutrality. I'm fighting for that. But that's going to require audacious policy making in how we power our buildings, in the kind of transportation network that we have, in the way we deal with our waste, in our food system. All of it, we need to push really hard to break our dependence on fossil fuel energies. And we have a big role, and we're making progress and much more work to do, which perhaps we can talk about. We also, while we're fighting that fight, have to acknowledge that we are a little island on the edge of the ocean, and we are very, very vulnerable to rising seas and extreme weather, and we have not done near enough to deal with that. We're coming up on the 10th year anniversary of Superstorm Sandy, and we have barely made progress in Manhattan in hardening our coastline, particularly in low-lying areas that flooded in Sandy and are vulnerable to future floods. We've got to invest and work much more quickly in hardening our coastline and raising our coastline in the low-lying areas. We've got to deal with the fact that now flooding can occur anywhere because of extreme rain events. When we're seeing an inch of rain an hour in some of these storms, we're seeing even higher areas, higher elevation areas like Washington Heights and West Harlem that are hundreds of feet above sea level are flooding. And we have a subway system that tends to flood when it rains heavily. None of that is acceptable. We have to do much, much more through green infrastructure that can absorb storm runoff. One of the plans that I'm pushing that will help with that is to plant 1 million more trees in New York City. There was a great initiative about a decade ago to plant 1 million trees. Very successful. We want to do it again. We're talking about street trees, which can absorb storm runoff and actually cool a neighborhood by some estimates as much as 20 degrees. There is tremendous inequality in where street trees are planted. If you go to a neighborhood like East Harlem, there are comparatively few street trees, and it's why that neighborhood is much hotter than other parts of the city during heat waves. We also want to plant trees on NYCHA campuses and on rooftops and schoolyards in natural areas of the city. This will, of course, remove CO2 from the atmosphere and make us more resilient as a city. One of the many strategies that we need to push to deal with this crisis. I think my broader message for all of you as people who I know care about the future of our society and our planet is that if you only watch cable news or maybe see what's in your social media feed, generally the headlines when they talk about politics and policy are referring to Washington and Congress and the White House, and that's really, really important. But the issues that I've been talking about so far this morning, and so many of the issues that impact you and your neighbors on the day-to-day, whether it is transportation or affordable housing or public space or clean air or even civil rights, they're driven much more by policies made at City Hall or in our state capitol in Albany. And we need people to engage in local politics and government for that reason. The stakes are incredibly high, and participation is way too low. So my call to all of you is to get into the arena of local politics and government and talk about ways you can do that. But I'm just thrilled to be here, thrilled to be with St. Bart's, a community that I feel shares these values. And I'm excited now to get into your questions. So please, back to you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Mark. We have plenty of time for questions, so I encourage you, if you have questions for Mark and you're in the room with us, there are some question cards on that center table, and my colleague Manny Rodriguez-Leach will help collect those and bring them to me. If you're watching us online or if you're here in person, you can also submit questions via YouTube, the live chat function, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson@stbarts.org. Mark, I'm glad you talked about what a borough president does, because that was going to be my first question. I wonder what has surprised you about the role. You've seen this role from a different vantage point for 8 years, from 8 years on the city council. How has your idea of the role changed now that you've spent 7 months in it?
Well, it's true that most New Yorkers and most people in the world probably have no idea what a borough president does. However, there's a sense that someone with the title, with the word president in their title, must be doing something important. And so I have been continually taken aback by the extent to which my words matter and the policies that I'm pushing for seem to impact the public dialogue. When we were in the early stages of the horrific attack by Putin's army on Ukraine back in February and March, and we were worried about, I certainly was worried about New York City and Manhattan's role in that, both as a place where it's home to so many Ukrainian Americans. Little Ukraine, after all, is in the East Village. But I was also quite aware of how many Russian oligarchs use Manhattan as a safe harbor for their assets by buying very high-end real estate. So I called for the federal government to seize those apartments, to seize those assets. And boy, that went global. I was doing interviews with the BBC and outlets from Asia, and I don't think any of the people I was talking to had any idea what my actual powers are. But all they knew was some guy with the title of Manhattan Borough President was calling for the oligarchs' apartments to be seized, and it became global news. But I see that was a popular policy. And that was early in my tenure, and so I've understood the power of this platform, and it means I have to pick my words carefully and choose my battles carefully, but it also gives me enormous opportunity to weigh in and shape the dialogue on the future of the borough, and that's something I'm very grateful for.
Can you talk about your relationships with your fellow borough presidents and the mayor, and how you do or don't work as a team?
So we have a great class of borough presidents now. Three of my colleagues, four of us, all served together in the council. We started together in 2014, and we're very, very close. The Bronx Borough President, Vanessa Gibson, actually was the co-sponsor of the Right to Counsel legislation I mentioned. So we are very close allies. We were in the trenches on that fight and still are. And Donovan Richards from Queens and Antonio Reynoso from Brooklyn, also very close. The Staten Island Borough President, Vito Fossella, is from the other party. So won't really say we're as close politically, but we've also done good work together with him. My attitude is that when we can lock arms together on an issue we care about, that's very powerful. And in fact, all 5 borough presidents are working together on this Million Tree Initiative, even Vito Fossella from Staten Island, and that's wonderful. Look, vis-a-vis the mayor, I think our job is to support the mayor when we agree with his policies and to push back when we don't. And as borough presidents, when we push back collectively or support the mayor collectively, it has a much greater impact. There are a number of these very important boards and bodies where we each have seats. We each have seats on the City Planning Commission, on the Panel for Education Policy, which is basically like the school board. If the four of us lock arms to push back on the mayor, that's a big deal. And we've done that at times. I think it's an important counterbalance in government. It's an important check on government and one that we intend to use.
I know that in the last city council election, there was a lot of turnover in terms of the membership of city council. As someone who served on the city council, what can you say about the state of city politics right now? What are you hopeful for, and what are you a little worried about?
We have a fabulously diverse and dynamic city council. By so many measures, it's the most diverse city council in New York's history. It is comprised majority of women. I believe it's 31 women, if I'm not mistaken, out of a body of 51. It is majority people of color, and I think the youngest city council in history. There's a number of city council members in their 20s, and it really gives me hope to see the dynamism and the energy and the diversity of the body. I think New York City should feel really proud of the council. Look, this is a difficult time for politics nationally and locally. I don't want to sugarcoat that. We are confronting challenges where there are incredibly bitter divides. There's no less polarization in politics in New York City than there is nationally. Social media plays no less of a damaging effect in New York City politics than it does nationally. Amplifying conflict, certainly ensuring that the most incendiary voices rise to the top. And I was saying first about how it's mostly national issues that are in the news, and I think people are aware of all the ways that the polarization has impacted national politics negatively. It's happening here locally as well, on every issue that I've mentioned today. It does make it harder to govern. And there's polarization in the city council as well. They're not immune to it. It's going to make it more difficult for us to solve the problems I've mentioned today. Coming back from COVID, managing public health, the balance between the drive for justice in our criminal justice system and the desire for public safety. But I'm ultimately still quite bullish on the future of the city, quite bullish on the future of Manhattan. I'm absolutely confident we're going to get beyond this difficult moment. I think we already are, but we certainly have still more work to do, and that's what we're talking about today.
A lot of really good questions. The first one deals with an issue I know you've talked about in other recent interviews, congestion pricing. You talked about kind of climate change and our need to be prepared, but there's also and congestion pricing can help us be better stewards of the climate, but it's also about keeping our streets a little less busy. So can you talk about the status of that initiative?
Peter, you described it perfectly. It is really seeking to address two problems. The first is above ground. It's the fact that the level of congestion on our streets is already approaching unprecedented levels, and that is at a time when our office buildings aren't even half full yet. I mean, so you see it on Park Avenue. So if you extrapolate forward, as those buildings start to fill up, as we get more tourists coming, we're facing what some people call a carpocalypse. Layer on to that the rise of home delivery for Amazon and other online services, which is already far greater than it was pre-pandemic. And we face a level of gridlock on the streets, which is going to impact our economic development, our public health, our safety, and so much more. But there's a second crisis, which you also referenced, which is our chronically underfunded mass transit. And there are just billions of dollars of unmet capital needs in our mass transit. We have a subway system where I think it's 28% of stations have elevators or are otherwise accessible to people that use wheelchairs, and a system with signaling on some lines which dates to World War II, and it's one of the reasons why I see such delays, and many, many other unmet capital needs in the system. And congestion pricing addresses both of those challenges. It will create a zone, it'll be Manhattan south of 60th Street, where there's a charge to enter. I understand there's controversy here, which I'm going to address, but in terms of how it works, there'll be a charge to enter Manhattan south of 60th Street. That will generate $1.5 billion a year for our mass transit system. That amount that is actually set in law. And it will reduce the amount of traffic in the zone. There's been surveys which indicate that there are people driving in from the suburbs who will switch to mass transit. For Manhattanites, I understand that it's complicated, especially if you get around by car, especially if you live within the zone. And there are, some of the policies are still being defined, but there's going to be an exemption for people with disabilities because of what I just mentioned. The subway system's not an alternative if you have a disability. Perhaps one day in the future it will be fully acceptable, but we're not there yet. There's also going to be a credit to credit the full cost, actually, for people who live within the zone who are low or moderate income. So there are at least 2 carve-outs, and a panel was just established that will consider the possibility of additional carve-outs and other questions about just how the pricing structure will work. And I've been weighing in on many of these questions. We have put on the table the idea that there would be variable charge based on whether you're entering during peak hours or not. It's possible that off-peak there could be even zero charge. The idea is to deal with congestion. So if you're driving in at 2 a.m. on a Sunday, you're not in a peak congestion period. So it's possible there'd be no charge or minimal charge at that time. We've also put on the table the idea that there'd be a sliding scale based on the size of the vehicle, so that a smaller vehicle would pay less than a giant SUV, and of course a truck would pay more still. There's a possibility that there could be a discount for fully electric vehicles versus traditional gas vehicles. So there's a lot on the table here. If there's follow-up questions about what it means for you and your neighbors, happy to take them. But ultimately, we need this policy. It's worked around the world. We need the revenue. We need the congestion relief. And if done right, I think it's going to be a really positive change for Manhattan and New York City.
How, if at all, would it affect ride-sharing services? Is that still being discussed?
Yes, it is. Some of that is still up in the air. There was an early phase of congestion pricing that put a charge only on taxis of, I think it's $2.75 per ride for taxis, including Uber, et cetera. And there's a possibility that there could be an additional charge once the full system is in place. I think that would be a mistake. I think that there should be no additional charge. Particularly worried about the future of yellow cabs, which have suffered terribly in recent years. So my advice is that there be no additional charge on taxis, but that's not yet clear.
Question about zoning. You mentioned that office buildings are nowhere near their full capacity. Folks say something around 40%,
Yep.
I think. Do you anticipate there being changes in zoning so that office buildings might be transitioned into residential buildings?
I hope so.
If those office workers don't come back, at least at the same level as before.
Yes, that's a very, you have a very astute congregation here, Peter. That's an excellent question. First, let me say that while we're at about the low 40s in return to office, I'm sure you feel it on Park Avenue if you're here on a weekday. That we're going to go up. We're going to go up from 40%. We're not going to be stuck here. I think that if you look at businesses like Facebook and Google, Apple, they're all betting on the J.P. Morgan Chase. They're all betting on the return of in-person office work because of the power for collaboration and kind of serendipitous connections and more. But what you're seeing now is the people in real estate call it a flight to quality, where newer buildings which offer a more modern view of the office are highly sought after. So One Vanderbilt, not far from here, that opened during the pandemic, which some people thought would be a disaster. They fully leased up during the pandemic because that building has so many amenities, and employers decided that that's the kind of place that people do want to come back to work. And you look at what J.P. Morgan Chase is building up the block, that's another building with that level of kind of modern amenities, and I think that J.P. Morgan Chase is quite confident they're going to fill that up. I think it's 14,000 people. However, there's another story in office space of older buildings from the 80s or before that have more cramped spaces, don't have room for a lot of the amenities, don't have outdoor space, and those buildings are emptying out and they're losing tenants. And I'm not sure those buildings will ever fill up again because of what the modern office place needs to be. And there's something instructive in Lower Manhattan where the buildings emptied out after 9/11, and many of them were converted to housing. Quite successfully. Downtown is really a vibrant 24-hour community in a way that it never was, and that people didn't think it could be. Still lots of offices, but more than that. And they had the same problem. They had a lot of really old buildings that just weren't working. And so I think we can do that here. Now, there's a cautionary tale downtown, which is that virtually all of that housing conversion ended up being luxury, partly because it's very expensive to convert an office building to an apartment. Just think about all the new plumbing, and you got to build kitchens in places where there wasn't even a water line, and kind of the weird layouts because you need windows for bedrooms and these big floor plates, the geometry doesn't really work. So it's not easy, it is not inexpensive, and therefore when it happens on its own, they usually end up being luxury. So we don't want that to happen in Midtown. We want to have affordable housing, and that's going to require the city and the state doing some work. Obviously to rezone, but more than that, to put, I think, some financing on the table, maybe in the form of tax credits, so that we get affordable housing. And that'll be great for the neighborhood because you have diversity and dynamism in the neighborhood, but also it will help solve the massive affordable housing crisis. So this is very complicated, but what your question gets at the heart of the matter. There ultimately is a great opportunity here.
Housing is a topic that's on a lot of folks' minds, and you talked about affordable housing before. We're in this moment when, because of COVID, lots of people received steep discounts.
Right.
We're still in COVID, and yet prices are way above where they were before COVID. Can you explain how we got here, and how are we going to get ourselves out of it?
You know, it's hard to remember what the headlines were in the spring and throughout much of 2020, but I've kept some of them because I just enjoy going back to them. There was one that was, New York City is dead forever. That's an actual headline in the New York Post, of course. You might remember that one. But there were also more serious discussions. People actually questioned whether this concept of a crowded bar or restaurant would ever work again. No, I don't mean like they were saying whether it would work in those coming weeks. People were questioning whether, in an age of infectious disease, whether that model would ever survive. Do you guys even remember people were saying that? If you've been to a restaurant or bar in Manhattan of late, I think we can put that question to rest. But at the time, it wasn't sure. We were all stunned. We didn't know what was going to happen. And yeah, so the real estate market collapsed in that environment. But in the end, the things which have made Manhattan and New York City such a draw for people to live here, to work here, to visit here, to come to school here, they're still drawing people and will continue to draw people. Just the incredible vibrancy of our street life, the world-class cultural institutions, the incredible diversity and dynamism of the people who live here. It's still drawing people now. And that's a great thing for the future of the city, but there's a challenge when it comes to our housing markets. And it has meant that people have rushed back into Manhattan real estate, certainly from the residential perspective. Commercial, it's a little more complicated, but people want to live here, period. And they want to live here at a time where there's just not a lot of housing on the market. There really isn't, because we haven't built that much housing, and because the housing that we have is not really turning over. And that means there's an intense competition to get an apartment here. So when an apartment opens up for rent, there are long lines of people who want to rent it, and it's often renting above the asking price. When was the last time that happened? And I mentioned what the median rent right now for an apartment in Manhattan is $4,100 a month. That's the median. That means half are higher than that, and there are apartments in Manhattan which rent for 5 figures a month. It's mind-blowing. And the same dynamic in the sales market. That is, I believe that is a crisis for us as a society, because it means that the people who keep the city running, the people who are the heart and soul of the dynamism and diversity of Manhattan, are simply not going to be able to live here. We have a desperate need to build more housing, more affordable housing in this borough and in the city, and that is really difficult. The politics of that are really difficult, and it's a problem that we have to solve, or we're going to turn into San Francisco, which has built almost nothing, and where you must be a millionaire today to get an apartment in San Francisco. I'm actually not exaggerating. And that should serve as a cautionary tale. And I'm working on this. I mentioned before that my office has a role in land use. And so we are working on identifying how and where we can create the apartments that we need, especially affordable apartments. I want this to be a borough where a bus driver can afford to live. It's not right now. I want this to be a borough where a nurse's aide can afford to live. It's not right now. I want this to be a borough where a formerly homeless family can afford to live. It's definitely not right now. So this is the work that we have ahead of us, and it's one of my top priorities.
We see homelessness here on our campus every night. We also know well the issues with food inequity. We have a program that provides pantry access to guests and also provides meals throughout the week that's housed here. Where are we on issues of food equity, and what should we be doing differently?
Thank you, St. Bart's, for being so compassionate towards New Yorkers facing homelessness. I think that's been true about you for decades. And you've always seen the humanity in our fellow New Yorkers who are struggling, who are in crisis. And it's a great example to the city. This is a crisis which is even more acute than it was pre-pandemic, partly because of the housing market challenges I described, because it's just very difficult to get an apartment, therefore there are more people who wind up homeless. But you focused on the question of food insecurity, and there's been food insecurity in New York City for hundreds of years, and there definitely was pre-pandemic. But we've had a qualitative shift in the scale of that problem that we started to see in the first days of the pandemic. We have also run out of my office, well, starting when I was in the city council, a food pantry, and we went from seeing a couple of 100 people a day to over 1,000 people a day, and shocking the diversity of people in the line. It was people who, from all walks of life, who just lost their jobs or lost their livelihood or had a medical crisis. It really kind of defied the stereotypes. You probably see it here as well. There were a lot of amazing nonprofits and just grassroots volunteers who jumped in to deal with that. Really kind of an inspiring story about the way the city stepped up to provide food to people in need. The city government, I think this is something that the city government did very well, but hundreds and hundreds of grassroots entities did it as well. And we're going to need a systemic change in how we provide food to people in need. The old models don't work. We have to take it to another level. We need the old model where we just sort of had a truck back up and unload whatever was surplus into a room which people came into. We need to be more sophisticated. We need to use computer systems to bring in the right food, to connect it to people in the right ways, to organize home delivery, to make the experience feel more like going to a supermarket, so it's more dignified, to give people choice in what they eat, and to do for that piece of the food system what we have to do for the entire food system, which is to shift to less processed foods, more plant-based foods. That needs to happen not just in our high-end restaurants, but in our food pantries. And there are really good people who are working on this day and night, great nonprofits which are doing this without enough support from the city. And we need the city to be there for your food pantry here and for those who are going to have to dig in for a long-term work to deal with this challenge.
You briefly mentioned the tension between fighting crime and addressing issues of systemic justice. I know that fighting crime is one of the mayor's priorities. Can you talk about where we are in terms of crime and how you see us combating that issue?
Well, we have to, you framed it correctly, we have to do both. We have to address the systemic injustice, the systemic racism in criminal justice in the city and in America. We have to have a policing system which does not disproportionately target young men of color. We have to have a criminal justice system which does not perpetuate mass incarceration in a way that has, again, a brutally disproportionate impact on people of color. And we must address the fact that many New Yorkers feel less safe now. And that is true across all kinds of communities. That is true in my borough, not just in Midtown. It's also true in Harlem and Washington Heights. The data, which we always have to keep our eye on, is definitely more nuanced than the headlines in the tabloids, for sure. The data on public safety tells a story of enormous progress since the 90s, which was really the peak of crime in New York City. Enormous progress in every category. Today, across almost every category, crime is down probably at least 75% since the peak in the 90s. However, the data also shows that in the last couple of years, crime has been rising across most categories. And so what you feel on the street is real in that sense, because relative to 4 years ago, the numbers have started to move in the wrong direction, and that's unacceptable. There's even complexity within those numbers because this year we have been making some progress on shootings and homicide relative to last year. Still, it's unacceptable that we have this level of shootings, and there's been some really spectacularly horrific cases in Manhattan in recent months. Categories of crime other than that, robberies, et cetera, are up even from last year. So I spent a lot of time on the data there because I just think that sometimes this gets taken over by emotions, and we need to actually be clear about where we're at. We have a problem with guns in this country. It's not unique to New York City. It is incredibly easy to get access to guns in New York City and America. These are not guns made in Manhattan or New York City. We make no guns here. These are guns that are coming in from red states, if you will, Virginia, North Carolina, Ohio, where people bring them in here. They buy dozens and dozens of them in a gun store in a state that's permissive. We need national action to stop that. There's no reason why someone should be able to drive to Virginia and buy 50 semi-automatic guns. There's no sane justification for that. And we need to do more to prevent young people in New York City from going down that route of taking up a gun in the first place. And that means investing in after-school programs and youth development programs and employment programs. That these are programs which make communities more healthy in general and which are documented to help young people stay on a positive path and never be drawn into picking up a gun in the first place. We need investments in the kinds of programs which are called Cure Violence, which are community-based programs which do peer mediation and prevent conflict from escalating. And yes, we have to do more to take the guns off the street, which are already here. There is an estimate that there is as many as 1 million guns in New York City currently. And so we have to do more to reduce that number. But we have to do it through policing, which doesn't repeat the mistakes of the Giuliani era and has disproportionate, unfair impact landing on communities of color. So this is an incredible balancing act, and it's not easy. And we're not there yet. We're not there yet. We have much, much more work to do to achieve greater justice in our criminal justice system and a safer city.
We need to stop. We're already over time, but I'm going to fit one last quick question in there. You talked about how we should be involved in politics and public life. What are the things faith communities can do to help this city be the best that it can be?
Well, first, direct service, and you're doing that. You actually really should be the example that other faith communities should follow, so thank you for that. Thank you for investing in that. I know it's your time and it's your money and your space, and that is not easy. Thank you for that. I wish that faith communities also weighed in more as faith communities in some of the big policy debates that we're having. When we were fighting for right to counsel, there were many faith leaders who stepped up on that, and it was so impactful because people didn't expect faith leaders to weigh in. Obviously, you expected tenants advocate groups and on one side and landlord lobbies on the other side, but it was really impactful. And I would like to see faith communities continue to step into policy debates where people might not expect you to be there. So the fight to create more affordable housing shouldn't just be about finances and zoning categories. It should also be about values. And so to have faith leaders, faith communities stepping in to say, we need to build more affordable housing, and we're going to have to do it in neighborhoods where we haven't usually seen it. where neighbors might be a little uncomfortable. That would be very, very helpful. And I think it could change the dynamic. So I encourage you, St. Bart's and other congregations, to speak as faith communities. I think your values will be extremely helpful in informing the big debates and decisions that we have ahead for the future of Manhattan and New York City.
Well, Mark Levine, Manhattan Borough President, thank you so much for being with us
Thank you,
today.
Peter. Thank you, St. Bart's. This has been a great discussion. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right.
And thank you all for being here. We hope you'll stick around and join us for worship at 11 a.m. And we also hope you'll be back next week. We'll be welcoming a guest preacher, the Reverend Natasha Reed Rice, who serves as the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Habitat for Humanity International. See you next week.
Thank you.